Yo, boys, welcome back. We are within 1 week of the election, and we have a lot to cover. You've heard some of the stories in our intro. Pratik in the lab. PJ, at your bold insistence, I do think that we owe, we get into updates on the big elections people are tracking, the Supreme Court, Elon Musk, conspiracy theories that we are betting on. The list goes on. Before we get into that, I think we owe the boys just a quick 3-minute update on what's going on with the government versus degens, i.e. Kalshi and Predictive versus CFTC. We had a big missive from the federal government last week that basically indicated that the commission was not going to approve Kalshi to offer election markets, which is bad news. Is any way I can cut it. Do you want to give a quick update and tell me if I'm wrong to say this is bleak information to be receiving?
Well, so to be clear, to modify a little bit what you said, the Friday, the October 28th, was the self-imposed deadline by the CFTC, by which they said they wanted to make a decision on whether or not to approve Kalshi's election contracts. Now, we did not and have not, as of this recording, heard anything official from the CFTC yet, but Lydia Bayoud from Bloomberg, who covers the CFTC, has good sources from what I can tell, is reporting that the staff at the CFTC is recommending that the commission not approve Kalshi's contracts. Now, but as far as I know, the commission itself has not said anything, but I mean, traders are taking this news seriously. The market's now on Polymarket trading at just 9% on Insight Prediction, even lower, just 5% on Kalshi getting election market approval by election day.
So traders themselves pretty bearish on whether or not the federal government will say political election betting, great idea. Is there anything, maybe we can do a quick what's next and what the traders themselves can do if they want the government to hear them?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think what we've learned is a few different things. I think the first is that I think my strong suspicion is that the reporting is accurate. And I think that traders who believe that the commissioners are going to override the recommendation of the commission are probably too optimistic. I think the staff recommendation probably is going to carry the day. Now, I think that what we've learned is that regardless of what the commission's decision is, but in all likelihood, it's going to be a no, both Kalshi as well as some progressive public interest groups, Better Markets, I think is the name of the main one, have basically indicated that they're going to sue the commission, whichever way it goes. So I think that what we're just kind of waiting for now is, number one, have the commission officially make a decision and announce it. I think the rationale that the commission gives is going to be very important for why they either approve or deny it. But I think that in all likelihood, traders will not be able to trade on Kalshi on the elections. And this issue, as you and I have been predicting all along, is going to the courts one way or the other.
I want to give you credit. You have been predicting that. So I think we can come back to this. We've got some conspiracies about you in particular that we need to address at the end of the podcast. But let's leave that little bit of catnip for the boys. I want to sort of get to what we do, which is talk about politics and how to bet on them. So I'm going to start, I think, with new polls, which we will make less boring than the people who write them do. And then maybe go to the Supreme Court, which is actually giving us a fascinating line to bet on with affirmative action. But so just on Monday this week, Nate Cohn, the Upshot New York Times, released a poll that has reverberated actually quite a bit across the market, despite the fact that we all like to joke about polls being fake. If you've been paying attention to news in the elections, you know that it has at least appeared to be an absolute slaughterhouse for Democrats in the last couple of weeks. Voters, I guess, just one by one have woken up in the morning and decided that, you know, they want to see Joe Biden in a dumpster heap or something. So anyway, this poll offering some daylight for Democrats, showing that in Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Democrats Mark Kelly, John Fetterman, and Raphael Warnock having some breathing room and, in fact, a lead to win. And Nevada, where Adam Laxalt is challenging Catherine Cortez Masto, the Democratic incumbent, a tied race. Now, at the same time, Nate Silver, Nate barium, cadmium, tricopper glyceride, is now for the first time giving Republicans a slight edge in the Senate election. So what I'm trying to figure out, and I just remain baffled by how these elections are priced on Predicted, is which of these polls is fake. If we take for granted that at least half of polls are useless and fake. Do you think either of these indicators are worth listening to?
Well, I don't think these polls are fake, right? I think it's just a question of what is the right methodology you use and how reliable they are. So, my thought would be that in the vast majority of these polls that traders are responding to, I mean, they're not straight up push polls. They're not obviously fraudulent, but I think they're, best available guesses at what the electorate will look like and so forth. But my own view is that I'm putting a lot less stock in polling this year than I think I have in the past. And I'm just kind of looking for more qualitative indicators to round out what the picture will be.
I sort of feel like, one of the squishy lessons that I've learned betting on elections is that you need to have a good reason to bet against the wave, and sometimes you can get great pricing when we do that. Like on our last episode, we were talking about, quote, free money Democratic bets that, people are just piling on betting markets, on betting against any Democrat to lose. So I think you need a good reason to bet against the wave. And what that tells me is that if polls are showing maybe like a modest advantage for a Republican or a tie ball game, that's probably a buy for the Republicans. The problem I'm having with that is if you go look at betting markets, every goddamn Republican is so overbought. Like, again, I still just am not willing to pay high 60s, low 70s for, what's his face, Herschel Walker, too much football with his helmet off, or, Adam Laxalt in Nevada. I'm just like desperate for some sort of market correction because my money is just sitting on the sideline. But I do think we're seeing like probably a mid-sized Republican wave. And you need a good reason to bet on Democrats in these tight races if that's the case.
Yeah, I think I agree for the most part, although what I would say is from my kind of survey of the market prices, I think traders are quite confused. I think that the phenomenon that you mentioned of traders potentially overpricing a red wave is certainly available, I think particularly on predicted. But then there are other factors that I think lend themselves to some confusion. I think, first of all, the pricing between the betting exchanges, predicted and the others, actually is sort of less congruent than often it is. I would say predicted has had, from what I can tell, a bit more of a Republican or red wave bias built into it. But then at the same time, there are also places, I think, where there remain bargains on betting against the Democrats on the assumption that we're going to see a red wave. Something like the Wisconsin Senate race strikes me as a bargain. Right now you can still get Ron Johnson kind of in the mid 80s, which I think is not a bad deal. But then on the other hand, I think there are races, and we'll get into this later in the show, where I think, particularly on the governor side, where I think that Republican governor odds remain underpriced. As an example, New York, where now at least one poll is showing Lee Zeldin ahead, the markets remain very, very pessimistic that Republicans can win the governor's race there. So,
do you want to go there? Do you want to tell them? You want to tell them whose poll that was?
It was a Trafalgar poll, which accounts for part of the skepticism, I think, in the markets. But
let's step that out. So we had their founder. What's Mr. Trafalgar bow tie guy's name again?
Oh, Robert Cahaly.
Robert Cahaly. Well, I honestly, maybe my favorite episode of SSG ever. But for those of you who are betting your first election cycle, Trafalgar polls are infamously Republican leaning, infamously unorthodox, and actually quite accurate, or in aggregate quite accurate. But like anyone else, they have big misses. But showing Lee Zeldin, a Republican, ahead of an incumbent Democrat statewide in New York, where Dems have more than a 2-to-1 registration advantage, that's a big story. And you seem like you're willing to bite on this, PJ.
I have been saying all year, very, very early in the cycle, that this governor's race is well in play. I think that, first of all, let's look at the market pricing. Even today, after that poll, you got a little bit of movement on predicted. Right now, it's, the Democrats are trading in the 70s, but you look on Polymarket, traders have and remained very skeptical there. Right now, Democrats still have a 85-15 advantage. It's like up a little bit from 90-10 or something. but look, I mean, there's a lot of reason to believe that the Republicans can win. I've been saying this all year, and the reasons are very simple. I mean, first of all, yes, Kathy Hochul is an incumbent governor. Incumbency has its advantages, but she's not a traditional incumbent, in the sense that
she's never won.
Yeah, she's kind of an accidental figure.
Yeah.
She would not have been there but for Cuomo's meltdown. And then you look at what has happened on her tenure. There's, she presided over some of the heaviest handed COVID policies, which she's only partially backtracked on. Crime is just sort of out of control in New York. I'll get into that a bit more. Homelessness, likewise, remains a problem. You're seeing a massive exodus of New Yorkers leaving the state, which is, continued even after COVID restrictions have been released. And I'll finally say about candidate quality, I'll just make a quick point here. There's a very interesting dynamic, which I think traders are not taking into account, which is that normally in New York politics, you have New York City coming in big for the Democrats and the rest of the state being more Republican. You have unusual dynamics here where Kathy Hochul's base of support is she comes more from the northern Republican area, whereas Lee Zeldin is a member of Congress, a Jewish American from Long Island, and you can just see in both of their affects that their regional identity really comes through. So anyway, I'll stop there and we can get into
So I want to go deeper on this, but I don't want to belabor it too much because we covered it ad nauseum in our last podcast, but new information has arrived. So, thus we continue on. But like, you're where we had this conversation a year ago, we had this same conversation about Gavin Newsom, and polls were tracking what was supposedly going to be a close race and his, the Republican recall or whatever. And he absolutely shattered Larry Elder in that contest. So maybe I'm feeling a little bit chastened. I know an off-year election is going to be a different thing, but I just can't get over a 2-to-1 registration advantage. I agree with everything that you're saying, but I stand by what I said on the last podcast, which is if I'm looking for a reason to vote for a Republican, like Kathy Hochul does not give me that reason, as in like she doesn't piss me off as some like quote do nothing Dem or whatever like the like preening woke tone deaf thing that is driving people into the Republican Party. I don't see Kathy Hochul making that mistake. So at a 2-to-1 registration advantage, I still like her to win.
Look, I'll say two things. I mean, first of all, I was in New York this past weekend in Queens, and I had a chance to talk to a number of people. I mean, this is an area that is overwhelmingly Democratic. These are people who are overwhelmingly Democratic voters. I would say unanimously, two things came through in the conversations I had. The first is that everyone believes that this race is close, that the polling is real. So you hear a lot of people in our community, in the betting community, saying this is all noise or whatever. If it is noise, I'm not hearing that from people in New York. But I think the second thing I will say is that regardless of whether or not people plan to vote for Zeldin, I heard, again, two overwhelming sentiments. The first is that crime is something that people really care about, crime and the economy. And what people say in particular, I think this is very telling, is when people talk about crime, they're not thinking about gun violence. They're talking about people clinging to the walls in the New York subway and people being pushed over and so forth. So I think that's kind of an imperfect barometer of what people are thinking about. I think that's certainly an issue that cuts in the Republicans' favor. But to your point about, okay, we heard this in California recall. I mean, let's be very clear about what that parallel was. Those polls that were showing it to be a close race, those were pretty early in the cycle, well before Newsom really launched his re-election campaign, spent money or so forth. We're seeing the opposite trajectory here. What we're seeing is that the polls are tightening as we get closer to Election Day. And, whereas Newsom, I think, had a lot of room to maneuver and change course on some of his more polarizing policies. I don't know. I have not seen evidence that between now and the election, which is just a couple of days away, that Hochul can do a lot to change the dynamics. I think that what she is relying on is basically a bunch of money coming in, maybe national indicators not being overwhelmingly for the Democrats, etc., to eke this out. So I still think she's a favorite. I don't think she's an 85-15 favorite.
Do you know who agrees with you?
Who?
Mama Keen Dog. Pratik, I know we're like big deals and big stars when my mom starts texting us about our podcast. I don't think she's ever listened to one in her life until a couple weeks ago. Anyway, she said I should listen to you and bet against Kathy Hochul and Gretchen Whitmer. And not for nothing, she covered the Kentucky state legislature for 20 years. So she knows how the game's played.
Well, yeah, I think I would just say too, I mean, if you're interested in this issue, follow Flip Hidot. In addition to being a good trader, he's been early on the red wave, and he's a New Yorker from Long Island. So, I think
so.
He's
Can
a
I pitch you one more local knowledge thing?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sitting in a hotel room in Tucson, Arizona right now. As you know, Arizona is now a swing state, which was probably unimaginable 5-10 years ago. Anyway, so the only thing on TV other than football games and gun shows in Arizona are ads for the Senate race or I guess I should say the governor's race too. I don't really see a lot of pro Blake Masters ads that even feature Blake Masters. So what that tells me is that like he himself as a person, as we have sort of had people say on this podcast before, doesn't really have much of a constituency, doesn't really have like much of anything to draw on other than the fact that he's a vote against Joe Biden. So if I'm seeing polls that are suggesting that Mark Kelly still has a comfortable lead, I'm starting to feel inclined to believe that. So, I've had a no bet on Masters for a while. I've, don't want to sound like an idiot because we can always be wrong at some point, Pratik, but I've been unwinding my no position on Herschel Walker, thinking, maybe Ben Freeman's right that this is headed to a runoff, but I'm feeling better about sitting on my no on Blake Masters, just sort of seeing that no one's really selling Blake Masters here. They're just selling Joe Biden stocks, and so does Mark Kelly.
So I think that one question I'm trying to think about, and Robert Cahaly from Trafalgar has made me kind of think about things in a different way, which is that, the term he uses is social desirability. So
Right.
I think the premise of Trafalgar polling is that some candidates, there's a stigma to admitting you want to vote for them, whereas others, traders are more, or pollsters are more okay about people being polled are more okay with admitting that they're voting for. Someone like Lee Zeldin, I mean, I would say no question. I think there's a whole group of people in like Democratic New York who probably are going to vote for him, but would never admit it. What I don't have a sense of is, does a candidate like Blake Masters fall into that? Like, are there a bunch of independents or whatever in Arizona who would tell a pollster they're voting for Mark Kelly, but then end up voting for Blake Masters? I don't know. I'm curious what you think, but my sense would be that
he is.
Yeah.
I think if it was Mark Brnovich, the Republican Attorney General, you'd see that. But I just feel like it's why politicians say you got to start at the bottom or somewhere close to it. Why it's so hard to start at a statewide office is you're competing against people who have statewide brands. So it's a challenge, and maybe I'll be proven wrong. It wouldn't be the first time. But that's sort of my lean right now.
Well, yeah. I mean, look on just to close that out. I mean, on predicted, the Republicans are trading at 55%. The market pricing isn't quite efficient there. I guess my thought would be that if the markets are giving the Republicans kind of a sizable advantage going into election day, I would definitely take Mark Kelly in the 40s. I think that if Masters wins, as you said, it's not going to be on the basis of candidate quality. It's going to be on the basis of a red wave in Arizona just kind of reverting to its historical pattern.
Right. Okay, so let's go to the Supreme Court. I am going to quote from the Washington Post now. Quote, conservative justices on Monday seemed open to ending decades of Supreme Court precedent allowing race-conscious admissions decisions at colleges and universities, repeatedly expressing doubt that the institutions could ever concede a, quote, endpoint in their use of race to build diverse student bodies. After nearly 5 hours of argument, the affirmative action programs at Harvard and UNC seemed seriously endangered. The question is how broad such a decision might be and what it would mean for other elite colleges and flagship state universities that say relying on grades and test scores alone could result in dramatic drops in Black and Hispanic students. So setting aside the fact that affirmative action is one of the most interesting and contentious questions in the United States of America. It also happens to be one of the more interesting and contentious questions to bet on Kalshi, the website we were talking about up at the top of the program. So I'm actually sort of really, I don't have like a strong view on this, and I just think it's fascinating. So credit to Kalshi, they constructed this market sort of foreseeing the way the court would perceive the question. And it's really just a bet on whether there will be an outright full ban on use of affirmative action in university admissions, which is trading at 80 cents for a yes, or some sort of partial ban where they're allowed to consider it, say if it's in an essay or, as like a secondary factor that's inferred, or I'm not quite sure what that would be. But I'm like generally just like I don't really even know how to approach this question. I mean, have you followed the reporting on this? I mean, it sounds like obviously the shoe is going to drop in some manner, right?
Yeah, I mean, I listened to the vast majority of the hearing. I haven't quite gotten to the end of the Harvard one, but yeah, on Kalshi, the markets have been saying all along, and the market pricing didn't change too much. Traders believe there is roughly an 80% chance that we're going to see a universal ban. Now, the key to betting this one on Kalshi is you have to look very carefully at the rules here on the site. Yeah. And it's a bit too long for me to kind of read it here on the pod. But what I would simply say is, look very, very carefully at the rules here. And I mean, I guess the short answer here is that so all right. I mean, maybe some background is important here.
The short answer is we probably need to get Zoltar on the podcast.
Yeah, no, but so like an important question here is basically, so the only reason why these cases are in the courts is because Harvard receives federal funding, right? So if Harvard were to say, no, we're not taking federal funding, they can discriminate however they want, whatever.
Right.
So the ruling that I think the way Kalshi has designed the ruling is that basically what they're saying is if the Supreme Court says that institutions of higher education that receive federal financial assistance cannot use race as a factor in admissions, then that Kalshi is considering a universal ban. Whereas if the Supreme Court says that the plaintiffs, that Harvard cannot use race in the way that they are doing, that's not allowed, but they leave the door open to race generally. So in other words, if it's only a partial victory for the plaintiffs, that's where the 20% scenario or the 20% bracket is the winner.
Right. I mean, it's like you can almost judge it by how thick the envelope that comes from the court is. If it's like a thick envelope, it's like, okay, partial victory. If it's like a thin envelope, one sheet of paper, it's like, bad day for affirmative action hawks nationwide.
Did you watch the hearing or read the coverage or anything? Or
I read a lot of the coverage about it.
Are you involved in this market?
No, I'm not. I mean, I'm trying to make sense of the rules right now too. So maybe we'll just revisit this because realistically, the court's probably not going to rule until June anyway, right?
Yeah, that was my question. I mean, certainly it's not one of these things where there's an imminent announcement. We might end up getting some leaks from clerks and whatnot. But I guess what I'll say is that
we're gonna get like a butthurt like progressive clerk leaking this ruling the same way they did the abortion one, aren't we? I actually think that might happen. It seems like that would be a new precedent, right?
Well, I mean, if you listen to the hearing or whatever, I mean, I was pretty struck. Like certainly Sotomayor, but also I would say Elena Kagan, a number of these judges. I mean, they were sounding more like senators than Supreme Court justices at times in the hearing. I mean, it's clearly an emotional case. Now, maybe not to the same degree as abortion, but I think the more emotional, polarizing, politically sensitive the issue is, I think you figure the more likely we are to see a clerk leak whatever is down the pike.
I mean, that's what's so funny, though, is it's not like this is an issue that's extremely controversial in media, but it's not really controversial for normies. I mean, like every indication is that the vast majority of Americans, regardless of race, class, or political affiliation, think that these policies are stupid and should go away. It's there's like a huge dissonance here, which makes it all the more kind of interesting and entertaining to watch.
So, okay, I mean, I think that's a good segue to discussing why I'm not. I've been wanting to bet on this because I'm interested in the issue and I've been following it a lot, but I don't want to get involved with this market at 80-20. And basically, here's what gives me pause. I think there's no question in my view that the court's conservative majority in some shape or form is going to curtail the use of affirmative action. I think the questioning and previous votes from the justices make that clear. However, I mean, as you indicated, affirmative action is one of these things where you have a pretty big divide between how voters tend to vote on these in referendums and stuff, whereas
Yeah.
just how entrenched and significant the support is for affirmative action in basically every major institution in America. And you saw that in the hearings. Even, I think one of the best arguments for keeping affirmative action came from the U.S. military, right? So I think that what gives me pause is that, yes, there's a conservative majority that wants to rein this in to some degree, but I think the potential weak links are, number one, Justice Roberts, who we've seen time and again cares
I'm
about
throwing a
the
red flag on
institution and
that.
the credibility.
I'm throwing a red
Go
flag on
ahead.
that right now. Challenge flag.
Okay, why?
Isn't John Roberts like one of his most famous quotes ever from Seattle schools, where he says the way to end racial discrimination in America is to stop discriminating based on race or something like that? Like, isn't he one of like the most ardent
Oh,
opponents of this very thing?
well, yeah. I mean, even in the hearings, he had kind of a funny quip. It was something like the Harvard uh, lawyer was going on about how they give preference to how like certain categories
Yeah.
are
The Civil War crip.
determinative.
Yeah.
Yeah. Robert said, "Well, we didn't fight a war over oboe players."
Yeah.
No, look. So I have no doubt Roberts wants to rein in affirmative action, just like I have no doubt he wanted to rein in abortion. But I guess it's not beyond the realm to me that Roberts would err for a narrower holding. But
Right.
the other judge that I think gives me a lot of pause is Justice Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
Not because of anything he said in the hearings, but I've just followed the kind of clerks that he tends to hire and so forth. And I mean, the guy brand, I mean, let me put it this way: he's not a very ideological conservative. Everything in his track record suggests that, and he has gone out of his way to do major identity politics and affirmative action in his own clerk selection. I mean, he tends to very disproportionately pick women. He also picks a pretty broad ideological cross section. He's taken
Coaches women's
African
basketball.
American. Yeah, I mean, I know some of the like African American clerks he has picked. They're anyway. I'm not going to go much further except to say that nothing in his personal decision making tells me that he's viscerally like anti-affirmative action in the way someone like Clarence Thomas or Justice Alito are. So,
well, we definitely know from his confirmation hearings that he likes women a lot. I think how many times did he brag about coaching women's basketball while refuting having other predilections for women? So,
I mean, this is a guy in his confirmation hearing. He was bragging about having 4 of his 4 clerks be women. I mean, I can promise you, if you are picking clerks on the basis of merit in the applicant pool you get for elite clerks, you're not getting 100% of a female slate. So,
okay,
for what it's worth.
Let's slide very quickly. Brazil, Lula wins. The leftist candidate beats the right-wing Jair Bolsonaro, wins in a runoff that was a little too close to comfort. I'm glad that I held that bet, but I certainly was nervous at times. Are you taking anything from this? I basically am taking that, a lot of polls are fake, but also a lot of polls aren't fake. End of the day, polls were right to say that Lula was the favorite and was going to win, maybe by a much more narrow percentage, but don't completely distrust polls, because here we have this result. You got like a quick little button to put on this before we put it to bed for good?
You probably have more interesting things to say about this than I do. I had bet early on Lula before the first round, basically thinking that if he ends up winning by a bigger margin, maybe there wouldn't even be a runoff, or I could just cash out then. When it became narrow after the first round and the polling wasn't quite clear, I just kind of got out of the market. I didn't feel like taking a gamble on a 75-25.
That's how I feel about your New York
yeah.
take. I'm like, should I just like take the loss now? You're really making me nervous.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, what's his name? On Twitter, Matt Iglesias was kind of had a joke like his next piece is going to be about what Brazil tells us about American elections. I mean,
well, fuck it.
I don't know enough
about
Brazil. Yeah.
Forget it. Brazil.
I was just gonna say
we're done with you.
Yeah. All right.
See you
All
never. Right. Okay, let's talk about uncertainty for a second.
So, sorry, just to close out Brazil. That market, just for people unpredicted, is not completely over yet. There's a market that you should check out if you've been following this. Who will be the next Latin American leader out? So Bolsonaro is trading at 90%, and the reason is that people think that between now and the time he actually has to leave power, Pedro Castillo, who is in an extremely bad political situation in Peru, may end up leaving before. So I would say definitely watch that one. And the reason I say watch it is, number one, keep following Pedro Castillo's situation, but also what I am looking for here is evidence that maybe you have some deranged like MAGA or conspiracy theory people betting on Bolsonaro and the military to keep him in power. So I'm not involved in this one yet, but there may be some easy money here or like a big long shot payday here. So anyway, we can get into that more with an expert, but I wanted to flag that.
Okay, so let's go wide. So we started this podcast talking about how we're less than a week away from the election. A lot of what we're talking about is sort of the feeling of doubt, which I know all of you had. I said I was in Arizona. I had dinner with trader Iabvek, aka Kieran, who goes on the podcast from time to time. Most of you who are real degens know he's one of the best and most profitable traders in the business. All we talked about was like our doubts and all the uncertainty that we feel about, the races and currents that we talk about every single day in this election. I did find some solace. So I read a profile. Are you a Jim Kornacki fan, Pratik? Are you a big fan of the knack?
I mean, I see him on election day. I don't have a strong view on him.
So for those of you who need your memories refreshed, Jim Kornacki is a great American. He is the kind of nebbish MSNBC guy who wears like your dad's clothes from 2003, and he's kind of skinny and bald and has glasses, and he just dances around the map and starts screaming things about like why Montgomery County's precincts are turning out differently this year than last year. Like I said, he's a great American. We should have a bronze bust of him on our desk. He even does sports now. He's just a wonderful human being. Anyway, so Kornacki was profiled as one of the leading data experts on politics, and in the Washington Post, he said this quote: "Where a lot of people have confidence, I have doubts. My doubt to confidence ratio is extremely high." That's coming from one of the leading election forecasters on the planet. And I was also listening to Nate Silver's podcast, which is frankly better than we give him credit for. And he told his co-host Galen, if you've listened to it, Galen's the guy who kind of brings the personality and Nate brings the facts, that this podcast was recorded a week ago. He said, basically at this point, like, all these conversations are stupid. Go to sleep, set an alarm, and wake up on E-Day and see what happens. So I guess my question is, we're 40 minutes into this podcast. Was this whole thing just a foolish exercise? Like, is there really anything that we can glean that is meaningful this close to the election, or are we just searching for threads that probably lead nowhere?
No, I mean, look, I think that the point Silver made may be correct for his audience, but I don't think it's correct for ours. I mean, at the end of the day, we're not just in the business of getting the official outcome or the end outcome correct. There's plenty of opportunity to trade against other traders and to make money on the basis of market fluctuations. So we certainly got a hint from Pennsylvania on how any event can really move the markets quite a bit. So as even though I share a kind of the view that I think you articulated about, and Kornacki articulated about, just major doubts about what's going to happen and uncertainty, I fully expect that between now and the election day, there are going to be plenty of ways to trade on new information coming in, new polls coming in, and just kind of watching the markets ebb and flow. So
I think also we
yeah.
just like Nate Silver makes attempts to do this, but he obviously hasn't figured it out yet. I mean, traders, the meme is that we're forward looking and pulsers are kind of rearward looking. But like a lot of what we do is price in things that deliberately Nate Silver and Jim Kornacki kind of ignore. Like, how do you price in whether or not Blake Masters' face is in his own campaign ads? It's not the type of thing they talk about. And like at the end of the day, those are the things that we're dumb enough to think we can find an advantage in. And sometimes we're right, and other times we're wrong. And thus, the times between, we experience the same level of doubt that the biggest stars do too.
Well, look, I mean, I would have to listen to the pod that you're referring to, but in a sense, I think Nate Silver is wrong in an important respect. Where I mean, in the final week of the campaign, you do see significant changes in campaign spending and so forth, right? And
Right.
in particular, that's kind of a period where an incumbent senator or governor can really pull out the stops. I mean,
But do
we
you
saw an
still believe
example.
that? Do you
Yeah.
like? I mean, do you still believe that with early voting, with how saturated these close markets, these close races are? I mean, it's been wall to wall coverage and advertising for these candidates in these swing states for going on 2-3 months now.
Yeah, but like, I mean, okay, we saw, for example, last week when Obama showed up in Wisconsin, and that clip of him basically demagoguing Social Security went viral for a couple of days. Um, so yeah, I think we're going to see meaningful changes. I mean, I think Biden probably is going to go campaign. I heard a rumor. I haven't confirmed it that he may be going to New York to
Yeah.
campaign for Kathy Hochul. But so what the point I was going to make
World's
is
most
that
boring Democrats show up on stage together. Is that the pitch for that show?
yeah. Well, um, I mean, I think, look, I fully expect that between today, November 1st, and the eve of the election, there will be far more clarity in the markets that some races where traders believe might be in contention will effectively be trading at like 95.5 pricing.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, other races where traders currently think it's lopsided in favor of one or the other, you may see more even pricing. And you could see that in both directions, like maybe something like Washington, the Senate race, where traders are skeptical that could be close. Repeated polls showing it's close might actually move that closer to 50-50.
Or like a
On
silver
the other
alert,
hand,
like if John Fetterman had a silver alert in Pennsylvania or something.
yeah, or like a lot of these governor races could move closer to 50-50, but also something like the Arizona governor race. I mean, if polls just repeatedly show Kari Lake with like a 5-point lead or something, I mean, that one on the eve of the election could just go very lopsided in her favor. So
Yeah.
I guess the point is, I think I would say for trading purposes, don't buy the Nate Silver argument. I think there's a lot of opportunity to make money and see changes between now and the eve of the election.
All right. Well, I can't top that. So go forth, be prosperous, do things that scare you, and but don't scare you too much because we don't want you to lose all your money. But if you are doubtful, if you do have concerns, so does everybody. So do your own research. Of course, we'll be surfacing the best insights we can find here on Star Spangled Gamblers. But it's going to be fun headed down the road to Election Day, fam. But for now, why don't we just say goodbye? Pratik,
Yeah,
thank you.
sounds good.
Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.